October 14th, 1943, 28,000 feet above the industrial heart of Germany, Second Lieutenant Robert Hughes watched his formation of B-17 flying fortresses carve white contrails across a crystalline sky that offered nowhere to hide. The target was Schweinfurt, home to Germany's vital ball-bearing plants, and Hughes knew from the pre-mission briefing that without long-range fighter escort for the deepest penetration, his bomber group would face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone. What he couldn't know was that within minutes, his aircraft and every bomber around him would become part of a desperate experiment in survival, testing whether American defensive firepower could truly turn a formation of heavy bombers into an impenetrable fortress of interlocking fire, or whether German fighter pilots would discover fatal flaws in tactics that looked brilliant on paper but had never faced this scale of coordinated assault. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress emerged from American aircraft factories, bearing a name that promised invincibility through firepower, rather than speed or maneuverability. Unlike fighters built for agility and individual combat prowess, the B-17 represented a fundamentally different philosophy of aerial warfare. Strategic bombing doctrine held that formations of heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive boxes could protect themselves through coordinated defensive fire that created overlapping fields of destruction no attacking fighter could penetrate and survive. This theory, developed through peacetime exercises and refined through carefully controlled testing, assumed that bomber gunners working together could cover every approach angle with sufficient firepower to destroy or drive away attacking fighters before they could press attacks home to lethal range. The early months of American daylight bombing operations over Europe would test these comfortable assumptions under the harshest possible conditions, revealing both the promise and the profound limitations of relying on defensive firepower alone. The B-17G model, that became the standard production variant by late 1943, carried 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, positioned throughout the aircraft to provide comprehensive defensive coverage. 2 guns in the chin turret beneath the nose addressed the frontal vulnerability that earlier models had exposed. Twin guns, in the top turret behind the cockpit, could engage targets above and to either side. The ball turret suspended beneath the fuselage mounted 2 more guns covering the vulnerable belly approach. Twin guns in the tail turret protected against rear attacks. Additional single guns in the waist, positions on both sides of the fuselage, the radio compartment, and both cheek positions in the nose completed the defensive armament. Each position was manned by a dedicated gunner trained to watch specific sectors and engage threats as they appeared. On paper, this arrangement created a sphere of protective fire around each bomber that should theoretically destroy any fighter attempting to press an attack. In practice, the reality proved vastly more complex and considerably less reassuring than the doctrine suggested. The 50 caliber Browning M2 represented one of the finest heavy machine guns ever produced, combining substantial hitting power with remarkable reliability even under the brutal conditions of high-altitude combat. The half-inch diameter projectile carried enough kinetic energy to punch through aircraft aluminum skin, damage critical components, sever control cables, and kill or wound crew members with a single hit. Multiple hits from 50 caliber fire could tear chunks from wings, destroy engines, rupture fuel tanks, or break aircraft apart in mid-air. The weapon's mechanical reliability meant it continued firing through violent maneuvers, extreme cold at altitude, and the vibration and stress of sustained combat. When everything functioned as designed, a single B-17 could theoretically put 50 caliber rounds into any attacking fighter from multiple angles simultaneously, creating a genuinely deadly defensive capability that demanded respect and caution from even the most aggressive German pilots. However, the gap between theoretical firepower and practical effectiveness in actual combat proved larger than pre-war planners had anticipated. Gunners faced extraordinary challenges that significantly reduced their ability to deliver accurate, coordinated fire under combat conditions. At operational altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Gunners wore electrically heated suits that often malfunctioned, leaving men struggling with numbing cold that made fine motor control nearly impossible. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes during every mission. Oxygen masks became essential for survival, but restricted vision and communication. The physical environment inside a B-17 during combat operations at altitude resembled conditions more appropriate to polar exploration than anything resembling comfortable working conditions for men expected to perform precise tasks requiring split-second timing and accurate spatial judgment. The intellectual challenge of deflection shooting added another layer of difficulty that separated theoretical capability from practical effectiveness. Hitting a target moving at 300 miles per hour or faster, while the gunner's own platform moved at similar speed in a different direction, required calculating lead angles that changed constantly as ranges and aspect angles shifted. Gunners had to estimate range accurately, judge target speed and direction, calculate the required lead, and then track smoothly while squeezing off bursts at precisely the right moment. All of this had to happen in seconds, while under intense stress, often while being shot at by the very target they were attempting to engage. Even experienced gunners with hundreds of hours of training missed far more often than they hit under these conditions. New gunners with minimal training arrived at operational units, barely capable of operating their weapons safely, much less employing them effectively against targets that appeared briefly, maneuvered violently, and disappeared before most gunners could even get rounds down range. The confined spaces inside a B-17 further complicated defensive operations in ways that became apparent only through hard experience over defended German territory. Gunners could not move freely between positions to reinforce threatened sectors. Each man remained locked in his assigned station, watching his designated sector, while other areas might face concentrated attack. The ball turret gunner hung, suspended in a rotating sphere barely large enough to contain a man and his weapons, unable to wear a parachute due to space limitations, completely dependent on his crewmates to hand crank him back into the aircraft if the turret mechanism failed or if the order came to abandon the aircraft. Waist gunners worked in an unheated section of the fuselage, exposed to screaming wind through open gun ports, standing for hours while watching for threats and trying to avoid shooting off their own aircraft's tail or hitting adjacent bombers. Communication between positions relied on intercom systems that frequently failed due to battle damage, equipment malfunction, or simple overload as multiple crew members tried to report threats simultaneously. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. German fighter pilots recognized these limitations quickly through combat experience and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the gaps between theoretical defensive coverage and practical reality. Frontal attacks became the preferred German approach by 1943, exploiting the period before chin turrets became standard equipment when the nose of a B-17 remained relatively undefended, except for handheld guns fired by the bombardier and navigator through small windows. Attacking head-on compressed closing speeds to over 600 miles per hour, giving gunners less than 2 seconds to acquire targets, calculate deflection, and fire accurate bursts before the fighter flashed past. The psychological impact of watching enemy fighters boring straight toward the cockpit proved severely unnerving, even for experienced crews. Pilots and co-pilots sat behind relatively thin aluminum and plexiglass that offered no real protection against cannon shells or machine gun bullets. The closing geometry meant that any rounds fired by the attacking fighter traveled directly toward the most vulnerable and critical part of it, the bomber, the cockpit, and forward crew compartment, where pilots, bombardier, and navigator concentrated. The standard German fighter armament of 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns delivered devastating firepower when concentrated on a single bomber. Cannon shells exploded on impact, tearing huge holes in aluminum skin, destroying control surfaces, rupturing fuel tanks, and killing crew members with explosive force and deadly fragments. A 2-second burst from a Messerschmitt, Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf Fevue 190, firing all weapons could send 200 rounds toward a target. Even a handful of hits in critical areas could cripple or destroy a B-17. German pilots learned to aim for engines, which, when hit, would often catch fire and burn uncontrollably. They targeted cockpits, knowing that killing or wounding pilots could send bombers plummeting out of formation. They aimed at wings near the fuselage where fuel tanks concentrated, hoping to rupture tanks and ignite the high-octane aviation gasoline that burned with terrifying intensity. Formation flying itself imposed severe tactical constraints that limited bomber flexibility and created predictable patterns German fighters exploited ruthlessly. Combat boxes positioned bombers in staggered altitudes and spacing calculated to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire while allowing adequate maneuvering room to avoid collisions. Maintaining proper formation discipline required constant attention from pilots who fought fatigue, watched for threats, monitored instruments, and coordinated with other crew members throughout missions that lasted 8 hours or more. Breaking formation for any reason immediately made a bomber vulnerable to concentrated attack. German fighters watched for stragglers, damaged aircraft unable to maintain formation, speed, and position, and attacked these isolated targets with overwhelming force. A bomber that fell behind its formation could expect to face multiple fighters attacking from all angles simultaneously, completely overwhelming the defensive capabilities of any single aircraft, regardless of how many guns it carried or how skilled its gunners might be. The combat box formation employed by American heavy bomber groups represented the most sophisticated attempt to create mutual defensive support through coordinated firepower. Lead, high, and low squadrons flew in precise relationships that theoretically allowed gunners on multiple bombers to engage any fighter, attacking any other bomber in the formation. The concept appeared sound during training exercises conducted over friendly territory without live ammunition or genuine threats. In combat over Germany, with fighters attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, with gunners struggling against cold and hypoxia and fear, with visibility obscured by contrails and gun smoke and battle damage, the clean geometric precision of formation diagrams dissolved into confused chaos where identifying threats and coordinating fire became nearly impossible tasks that most crews simply could not accomplish under the brutal conditions. The second Schweinfurt mission, on October 14, 1943, exposed the brutal reality of what happened when bomber formations penetrated deep into Germany without adequate fighter escort. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 seconds against ball-bearing factories, whose destruction American planners believed would cripple German war production. German controllers tracked the incoming formations from the moment they crossed the coast, vectoring available fighters to intercept positions and coordinating attacks that would continue throughout the bombers' penetration, target run, and withdrawal. Without long-range fighters to escort them beyond the limited range of P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Spitfires, the bomber formations flew alone through hundreds of miles of German-controlled airspace where Luftwaffe fighters waited in overwhelming numbers. German fighter units launched wave after wave of coordinated attacks against the American formations, employing tactics refined through 2 years of experience fighting heavy bombers. Groups of fighters would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, forcing gunners to divide their attention and making coordinated defensive fire nearly impossible. Some fighters would make feint attacks to draw defensive fire, while others pressed real attacks from different angles. Experienced German pilots learned to attack from directly ahead or directly behind, where bomber defensive fire proved least effective, and where even short bursts could inflict catastrophic damage. They learned to focus attacks on specific bombers, concentrating fire rather than spreading attacks across multiple targets, overwhelming the defenses of individual aircraft through sheer weight of firepower before moving to the next victim. The American bomber crews fought back with every weapon and every ounce of courage they possessed. Gunners fired long bursts at attacking fighters, even when accurate hits seemed impossible, hoping that sheer volume of fire might score lucky hits or at least force attackers to break off early. Pilots held formation positions with grim determination, even as bombers around them exploded or fell away, trailing fire and smoke. Bombardiers stayed focused on their bomb sites during attack runs, even with cannon shells tearing through their aircraft. Radio operators and navigators grabbed whatever weapons they could reach and added their fire to the defensive barrage. The crews demonstrated extraordinary courage under conditions that exceeded anything they had experienced during training or imagined during the relative safety of pre-mission briefings back in England. But courage alone could not overcome the fundamental tactical reality that the bomber formations faced. 60 B-17 seconds failed to return from the Schweinfurt mission, shot down by fighters or destroyed by flak over the target. Another 17 bombers sustained damage so severe they had to be written off after landing at emergency fields or limping back to England. More than 600 American airmen died, were severely wounded, or began long captivity as prisoners of war. The losses represented more than 20% of the attacking force, an attrition rate that clearly could not be sustained. Even more concerning from a strategic perspective, the bombing failed to achieve decisive results. German ball-bearing production recovered quickly through dispersal, repairs, and increased output from surviving factories. The mission accomplished far less than it cost, calling into question the entire concept of unescorted daylight precision bombing. The brutal mathematics of the Schweinfurt losses forced American commanders to confront uncomfortable truths about daylight strategic bombing that contradicted years of carefully constructed doctrine and optimistic planning. Deep penetration missions, without adequate fighter escort, resulted in unsustainable casualties that would exhaust available bomber crews and aircraft long before achieving decisive strategic effects against German war production. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration raids while desperately seeking solutions to the fighter escort problem that had seemed manageable during peacetime planning but proved catastrophically urgent under combat conditions. Behind closed doors at headquarters, senior officers debated whether daylight precision bombing remained viable or whether American forces should adopt British night bombing tactics that relied on area attacks against cities rather than precision strikes against specific industrial targets. The crisis threatened to undermine the entire American strategic bombing campaign before it could demonstrate effectiveness. German fighter pilots who participated in the Schweinfurt battles returned to their bases with mixed reactions that revealed the complexity of their tactical situation. They had inflicted devastating losses on American formations, demonstrating conclusively that unescorted bombers remained vulnerable regardless of defensive armament or formation tactics. Their commanders praised the coordinated attacks and aggressive tactics that produced such impressive results. Victory reports circulated through Luftwaffe units, boosting morale and reinforcing confidence in German fighter capabilities. Yet experienced pilots recognized disturbing trends that tempered celebrations and suggested darker implications for the future. The bombers had continued toward their targets despite horrific losses, demonstrating American willingness to absorb casualties that would have forced other air forces to abandon operations. More Americans would certainly come, in even greater numbers, and eventually they would solve the escort problem that currently allowed German fighters to attack with relative impunity. The defensive firepower that American bombers brought to each engagement genuinely concerned German pilots even as they celebrated tactical victories. Every attack run through the crossfire of a combat box involved calculated risk that could turn deadly with a single mistake in timing or approach angle. Experienced pilots respected the 50 caliber Browning guns and understood that even brief exposure to concentrated defensive fire could prove fatal or crippling. They watched comrades die or bail out of damaged fighters after encountering the massed defensive fire that bomber formations generated. They saw fighters return to base with battle damage from bomber defensive guns, holes punched through wings and fuselages, damaged engines trailing smoke, wounded pilots bleeding in their cockpits. The bombers were far from helpless targets. They fought back with substantial firepower that demanded tactical sophistication and careful planning rather than simple aggressive attacks that ignored defensive capabilities. German pilots developed a healthy respect for American gunners, who demonstrated improving effectiveness as crew experience accumulated. Early missions featured relatively inexperienced gunners who struggled with deflection shooting and often wasted ammunition on targets far outside effective range. Later missions encountered veteran crews whose gunners had survived multiple combat sorties and learned through brutal experience how to lead targets effectively, when to fire, and when to hold fire for better opportunities. These experienced gunners posed genuine threats that German pilots ignored at their peril. Multiple German aces fell to bomber defensive fire during 1943 and 1944, their names added to casualty lists alongside less experienced pilots. The randomness of defensive fire meant that even a poorly aimed burst could score lucky hits that damaged critical components or wounded pilots. Every attack carried inherent risk that skill and experience could reduce, but never eliminate entirely. The evolution of German tactics throughout 1943 reflected ongoing efforts to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Fighter groups experimented with different approach angles, attack formations, and coordination methods, seeking optimal balance between hitting power and survival. Frontal attacks from 12 o'clock high became preferred methods because they minimized exposure time to defensive fire while maximizing the attacker's chance of inflicting critical damage with short bursts. The high closing speed compressed engagement time to seconds, giving gunners minimal opportunity to track and fire accurately before fighters flashed past. Attacks from directly astern required fighters to match bomber speed and fly through sustained defensive fire from tail gunners, making them considerably more dangerous for attackers despite offering better tracking opportunities. Side attacks at beam angles provided reasonable compromise, allowing fighters to maintain higher speeds while presenting more difficult deflection shots to defensive gunners. Coordinated group attacks represented the most sophisticated German tactical evolution, requiring careful planning and precise execution under combat conditions. Multiple fighters would attack a single bomber simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming defensive gunners who could not track multiple threats effectively. Some fighters would make feint attacks to draw defensive fire, while others pressed real attacks from different directions. Heavy fighters equipped with rockets or large-caliber cannons would stand off at long range and launch weapons into formations, hoping to score hits through volume of fire rather than precision. These coordinated tactics proved devastatingly effective when executed properly by experienced units, but required level of training, communication, and coordination that became increasingly difficult to maintain as experienced German pilots fell to attrition and replacement pilots arrived with inadequate preparation. The introduction of American long-range escort fighters fundamentally transformed the tactical equation in ways that made German attacks against bomber formations progressively more difficult and costly. When P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers throughout entire missions during early 1944, German fighters could no longer wait for escorts to reach their fuel limits before attacking formations. American fighters stayed with the bombers from England to targets deep in Germany and back again, forcing German interceptors to fight through escort screens before reaching bombers. This change proved strategically decisive because it forced German fighters to engage American fighters rather than simply attacking bombers, completely changing the nature of defensive operations and dramatically increasing German pilot casualties. The bomber defensive firepower remained important, but became secondary to the protection provided by escorting fighters who could pursue and destroy German interceptors before they reached bombing formations. German pilots found themselves caught between opposing tactical imperatives that offered no satisfactory resolution. Orders demanded they attack American bomber formations to prevent the systematic destruction of German war production and civilian infrastructure. Professional military duty required obedience to operational orders, regardless of personal risk. Yet experience taught that attacking heavily defended bomber formations protected by swarms of long-range fighters resulted in catastrophic German casualties that could not be sustained indefinitely. Pilots who pressed attacks aggressively often died in their first few missions. Pilots who exercised excessive caution failed to achieve mission objectives and faced criticism from commanders who demanded results. Finding the narrow path between suicidal aggression and ineffective timidity required exceptional judgment that few pilots possessed and that even experienced pilots struggled to maintain under the relentless psychological pressure of daily combat operations. The human cost of bomber defensive operations fell hardest on the young men who crewed the guns throughout missions that lasted 8 hours or more. Waist gunners stood exposed to freezing wind, screaming through open gun ports at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. Ball turret gunners hung suspended beneath the aircraft in rotating spheres so cramped they could not wear parachutes, completely dependent on crewmates to retrieve them if the aircraft needed to be abandoned. Tail gunners worked in isolated positions separated from the rest of the crew, unable to see what happened forward, relying on intercom reports that might or might not arrive depending on equipment functionality and whether other crew members could spare attention from their own desperate situations. Radio operators and navigators divided attention between their primary duties and manning defensive guns, trying to fulfill multiple critical responsibilities simultaneously under conditions that made even single tasks extraordinarily challenging. The psychological toll of combat operations accumulated with each mission, wearing down even the strongest personalities through repeated exposure to violence, fear, and death. Crews watched bombers beside them explode in mid-air, disintegrating in fireballs that killed entire crews instantly. They saw aircraft fall away with wings shot off or fuselages broken in half, tumbling toward Earth, while perhaps a few parachutes blossomed from the wreckage. They counted chutes desperately after watching crews abandon doomed bombers, knowing that each missing parachute represented a man who died unable to escape, or whose parachute failed, or who was already dead from wounds sustained in combat. They watched fighters burn after taking defensive fire, sometimes seeing enemy pilots bail out, sometimes watching the aircraft spin down, trailing fire with the pilot still trapped inside. The accumulated trauma of watching men die, both comrades and enemies, created psychological burdens that affected every crew member regardless of individual emotional resilience. Combat fatigue became a significant operational concern as crews accumulated missions toward the 25 sortie requirement for tour completion. Men who began their tours eager and confident gradually showed signs of strain that manifested in various ways. Some became withdrawn and quiet, retreating into themselves between missions. Others developed nervous habits, fidgeting constantly, unable to sit still. Sleep problems plagued nearly everyone, with nightmares disrupting what rest men could find. Physical symptoms appeared: tremors in hands, digestive problems, headaches that wouldn't respond to medication. Some men reached breaking points where they simply could not force themselves back into aircraft for another mission, their psychological resources completely exhausted. The military labeled this condition lack of moral fiber and treated it harshly, but medical officers increasingly recognized it as genuine psychological injury, resulting from sustained exposure to combat trauma that exceeded human capacity to process and endure indefinitely. The bond between crew members became the primary psychological defense against the accumulated stress of combat operations. 10 men flew together, depended on each other absolutely, and shared experiences that no one outside the crew could truly understand. Pilots relied on navigators to guide them to targets and home again through weather and battle damage. Bombardiers knew their moment over the target represented the purpose of everyone's risk. Gunners protected the entire crew through their vigilance and skill. Engineers monitored complex aircraft systems that kept everyone alive. Radio operators maintained tenuous connection to outside world through crackling static and equipment that regularly failed. Each man's contribution mattered absolutely. Each man's failure potentially killed everyone. This mutual dependence created bonds deeper than ordinary friendship, connections forged through shared danger and collective survival that lasted lifetimes for men fortunate enough to complete their tours. The strategic impact of American bombing operations depended not on individual mission results, but on cumulative effects achieved through sustained campaigns that gradually overwhelmed German defensive capacity and industrial resilience. Early raids achieved limited physical destruction relative to effort expended and losses sustained. German industry proved remarkably resilient, dispersing production, repairing damage quickly, and maintaining output levels that surprised Allied intelligence analysts. However, the sustained pressure of continuous bombing operations forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense that might otherwise have supported ground operations. Thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns remained in Germany to defend against bombers rather than supporting ground forces fighting in Russia or France. Hundreds of thousands of personnel manned air defense systems rather than serving in combat units. Fighter aircraft and pilots desperately needed in ground support roles stayed in Germany intercepting bombers. The indirect effects of forcing these resource diversions arguably contributed more to ultimate Allied victory than direct destruction of industrial targets. The bombing campaign also served important strategic purposes beyond physical destruction of facilities. It demonstrated Allied commitment to defeating Germany through application of massive industrial and military power that Germany could not match. It maintained pressure on German forces across multiple theaters simultaneously, preventing concentration of resources against any single threat. It provided tangible evidence to Soviet allies that Western powers were contributing significantly to defeating Germany even before ground operations in France began. It boosted morale in occupied countries where people could see American bombers overhead and know that Germany faced enemies with resources to sustain massive military operations. These psychological and political effects, difficult to quantify precisely, nonetheless contributed importantly to the overall Allied war effort in ways that justified continued operations despite heavy costs. German civilians who lived through sustained bombing campaigns experienced the war's reality in immediate and terrifying ways that destroyed any remaining illusions about Germany's military situation. Air raid sirens wailing night after night drove people into shelters where they huddled in darkness, wondering if their homes would still exist when they emerged. Incendiary bombs created firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods, killing thousands in single raids through fire and suffocation rather than blast effects. High-explosive bombs collapsed buildings, burying families in rubble where rescue workers might or might not reach them in time. The accumulated stress of living under constant threat of sudden death from the sky created profound psychological trauma across entire populations. German propaganda tried to channel this suffering into hatred of enemies and determination to continue fighting, but for many civilians, the bombing demonstrated primarily that Germany was losing the war and that continued resistance only prolonged inevitable defeat and suffering. The moral questions surrounding strategic bombing remained controversial throughout the war and continue generating debate among historians and ethicists. Precision daylight bombing theoretically targeted military and industrial facilities rather than deliberately killing civilians. However, the reality of combat operations at high altitude using primitive bomb sites meant that many bombs fell outside target areas, destroying residential neighborhoods and killing non-combatants. The distinction between legitimate military targets and terrorizing civilian populations became blurred in practice, even when doctrine maintained clear separation in theory. American airmen generally believed they were attacking legitimate military objectives and that civilian casualties, while regrettable, remained unavoidable side effects of operations necessary to defeat Germany and end the war. German propaganda exploited civilian casualties to portray allies as barbaric, conveniently ignoring Germany's own record of deliberate attacks on civilian populations in multiple countries. The moral complexity of strategic bombing resists simple judgments and requires acknowledging that war itself creates impossible situations where all choices involve profound moral compromise. The effectiveness of bomber defensive firepower in deterring or destroying attacking fighters remained a subject of ongoing debate that post-war analysis never fully resolved. Statistical studies produced contradictory results depending on methodology and data sources used. American gunners claimed thousands of enemy fighters destroyed through defensive fire, but post-war examination of German records showed actual losses far lower than claimed totals. The chaos of combat made accurate assessment nearly impossible for gunners who believed their fire destroyed aircraft that actually survived with damage or were claimed simultaneously by multiple gunners firing at the same target. However, the mere presence of heavy defensive armament forced German fighters to approach cautiously, execute attacks quickly, and break away before sustaining damage from massed defensive fire. This deterrent effect provided real protection even when actual destruction of attacking fighters occurred less frequently than gunners believed. The psychological impact on German pilots, who knew they faced dozens of heavy machine guns whenever approaching, bomber formations cannot be dismissed, even if kill claims proved exaggerated. The courage required of bomber crews flying repeated missions into heavily defended German airspace exceeded anything that training could fully prepare men to face. Each mission began with pre-dawn wake-up calls that dragged men from inadequate sleep into cold darkness. Breakfast provided what nourishment men could force down despite nervous stomachs and anticipatory anxiety about the coming mission. Briefings revealed targets and expected opposition, sometimes triggering audible groans when particularly dangerous targets appeared on briefing room maps. Equipment checks and aircraft inspections delayed the moment of commitment, but ultimately engines started, aircraft taxied into position, and takeoff commenced whether men felt ready or not. Hours of formation flying in cold, thin air followed, maintaining precise position, while watching for fighters and trying not to think too much about what might happen over the target. The bomb run itself required flying straight and level through flak while fighters attacked, the most vulnerable and psychologically demanding portion of each mission, when evasive action was impossible and exposure to danger maximized. The return flight offered no relief because German fighters followed formations back toward England, attacking damaged stragglers and bombers that fell behind. Only after crossing the English coast could crews relax slightly, knowing they had survived another mission, but facing the certain knowledge that tomorrow or the next day they would do it all again. The post-mission rituals provided essential psychological decompression after hours of sustained tension and danger. Crews reported to debriefing officers who recorded observations about enemy tactics, flak concentrations, navigation challenges, and equipment performance. Intelligence. Officers questioned crews about enemy aircraft markings and tactics. Medical staff examined wounded crew members and arranged transport to hospitals for serious injuries. Ground crews immediately began repairing battle damage and servicing aircraft for the next mission, sometimes working through the night to keep bombers operational. Surviving crew members gathered to eat whatever food they could manage, drink whatever alcohol they could obtain, and process the day's events through conversation with others who understood because they had shared the experience. The empty bunks of crews who failed to return reminded everyone that survival remained uncertain and that tomorrow might bring their names to the missing list that posted after each mission. The transformation of American airmen from civilians into combat veterans occurred through repeated exposure to danger that could not be adequately simulated or prepared for through training alone. Young men who arrived at operational units, thinking of combat in abstract terms, learned quickly that war meant watching friends die in aircraft beside them, meant coming home with holes in their own aircraft and sometimes in their own bodies, meant confronting mortality daily through proximity to death that training never replicated. Some men adapted to combat stress better than others through temperament, previous life experience, or simply random variation in psychological resilience. All men changed through the experience in ways they carried throughout their lives. The bonds forged through shared danger and collective survival created connections that persisted decades after the war ended, with veterans seeking out crew members at reunions and maintaining correspondence across continents and through changing circumstances of peacetime lives. The legacy of bomber defensive operations extends beyond their immediate tactical and strategic impact to influence post-war military aviation in fundamental ways. The experience of bomber formations, fighting through determined fighter opposition, demonstrated that even heavy defensive armament could not protect unescorted bombers against competent opposition, once that opposition developed effective tactics and achieved local numerical superiority. This lesson influenced Cold War strategic bomber design, leading to increased emphasis on speed, altitude, and electronic countermeasures rather than defensive guns. Modern strategic bombers carry minimal defensive armament compared to World War II aircraft, relying instead on stealth, standoff weapons, and electronic warfare to penetrate defended airspace. The B-17's 13 guns represented the high watermark of defensive armament philosophy that subsequent experience proved inadequate for ensuring bomber survival against modern air defenses. The human stories of courage and sacrifice demonstrated by bomber crews flying repeated missions into defended German airspace deserve remembering not as abstract lessons about tactics or strategy, but as testament to what ordinary people can endure and accomplish when circumstances demand extraordinary effort. The young men who climbed into B-17 seconds morning after morning, knowing the statistics showed that completing 25 missions required surviving odds that killed or captured more than a third of crews, demonstrated courage that transcended simple duty or obedience. They flew because their comrades depended on them, because their country asked them to, because abandoning the mission meant abandoning principles they believed worth defending despite the terrible cost. Their willingness to face repeated danger, absorb horrific losses, and continue flying until the job was finished contributed decisively to Allied victory through persistence that Germany ultimately could not match. The question that German pilots confronted after engaging heavily defended American bomber formations was never whether defensive firepower made attacks dangerous. Every pilot understood clearly that pressing attacks through the crossfire of 50 caliber guns involved substantial risk that could turn deadly with a single mistake. The real question was whether that defensive firepower made attacks impossible or simply extraordinarily costly. German pilots answered through action rather than words, continuing to attack bomber formations throughout 1943 and 1944 despite mounting losses that exceeded sustainable rates. They pressed attacks because duty demanded it, because targets needed to be defended, because orders required engagement regardless of cost. But increasing casualties and the arrival of long-range escort fighters eventually rendered bomber defensive guns secondary to fighter protection, relegating even the impressive firepower of the B-17 to supporting rather than primary defensive role. The admission came not through words, but through the brutal mathematics of attrition that forced tactical evolution when existing methods produced losses that no air force could sustain indefinitely while maintaining operational effectiveness. The winter of 1943 brought a temporary reprieve to bomber crews as weather conditions over Europe deteriorated enough to curtail deep penetration missions. Heavy cloud cover, icing conditions, and violent storms made formation flying extremely hazardous even without enemy opposition. Crews used this operational pause to absorb replacement personnel who filled positions left vacant by casualties from the Schweinfurt mission and other costly raids. New gunners arrived at squadrons having completed stateside training but possessing no combat experience. Veteran crews watched these replacements with mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing that survival depended partly on experience that could only be gained through actual combat, and that some of these young men would not live long enough to acquire that experience. Squadron commanders attempted to distribute new crew members among experienced crews when possible, hoping that veterans could mentor newcomers and improve their survival odds through sharing hard-won knowledge about tactics that worked and mistakes that proved fatal. The technical evolution of bomber defensive systems continued throughout late 1943 and early 1944 as American designers attempted to address vulnerabilities revealed through combat experience. The most significant improvement came with the introduction of the chin turret on B-17G models, adding two 50 caliber guns beneath the nose to address the frontal vulnerability that German pilots had exploited so effectively. This modification required substantial redesign work and added weight forward of the center of gravity, necessitating careful rebalancing of the aircraft. The chin turret proved operationally effective, significantly improving defensive coverage against frontal attacks and forcing German pilots to modify tactics they had perfected against earlier models. However, the modification arrived too late for crews who had already faced frontal attacks in B-17F models that lacked this protection, and it added another position requiring a trained gunner when crew training already struggled to keep pace with operational demands. Improvements to gun sight technology attempted to address the fundamental challenge of deflection shooting that made accurate gunnery so difficult under combat conditions. New computing gun sights incorporated basic analog computers that helped gunners calculate lead angles based on target range and angular velocity. These devices represented significant technological advancement over simple ring and bead sights that required gunners to estimate lead angles through experience and judgment alone. However, the computing sights added mechanical complexity that sometimes failed under combat conditions. They required electrical power from aircraft systems that might be damaged in combat, and they still demanded that gunners accurately estimate range and smoothly track targets while under fire. The technology helped but could not substitute for fundamental skill development that required extensive training time that remained in chronically short supply as operational demands accelerated and training programs struggled to produce adequate numbers of qualified crew members. The psychological preparation for combat remained perhaps the most challenging aspect of crew training, and one that peacetime exercises could never adequately replicate. Training instructors who had completed combat tours attempted to convey the reality of what new crews would face, describing the sound of flak bursting around aircraft, the sight of bombers exploding beside them, the feeling of watching fighters bore in from 12 o'clock high with guns firing. These verbal descriptions, however vivid and sincere, could not truly prepare men for the visceral experience of combat, where every sense became overwhelmed by stimuli that triggered deep survival instincts, and where intellectual understanding of tactics dissolved into instinctive reactions driven by fear and adrenaline. The gap between knowing intellectually what combat involved and experiencing it physically and emotionally could not be bridged through training alone. Every crew discovered this truth during their first combat mission, when abstract concepts became immediate reality that demanded they function effectively despite fear that threatened to paralyze thought and action. The evolution of formation tactics reflected ongoing efforts to optimize the balance between defensive firepower and tactical flexibility. Larger formations concentrated more defensive guns in smaller airspace, theoretically creating denser defensive fire that attacking fighters had to penetrate. However, larger formations also increased collision risk during assembly and maneuvering, required more time to form up after takeoff, and created larger targets that flak gunners could engage more easily. Smaller formations allowed greater tactical flexibility and reduced assembly time, but dispersed defensive firepower and made individual elements more vulnerable to concentrated attack. Combat experience gradually refined formation parameters through systematic analysis of mission results, casualty patterns, and tactical effectiveness under various conditions. The optimal solutions varied depending on target location, expected opposition, weather conditions, and available escort support, requiring mission planners to balance multiple competing factors while making decisions that directly impacted crew survival rates. The relationship between bomber crews and fighter escorts evolved from initial mutual unfamiliarity to close cooperation based on shared experience and mutual respect. Early escort missions featured limited coordination between bombers and fighters, whose pilots often struggled to even locate the bomber formations they were supposed to protect. Fighter pilots initially viewed escort duty as boring defensive work that prevented them from seeking out enemy fighters for offensive combat that offered opportunities for personal glory and victory credits. Bomber crews sometimes failed to recognize friendly fighters and fired at escorts they mistook for German aircraft, creating dangerous friendly fire incidents that fortunately rarely resulted in actual casualties. Improved procedures gradually addressed these coordination problems through better briefings, standardized rendezvous procedures, radio protocols that allowed bombers to call for help when attacked, and visual recognition training that helped both bomber gunners and fighter pilots distinguish friendly from enemy aircraft quickly and reliably. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs in sufficient numbers during early 1944 fundamentally transformed the strategic bombing campaign in ways that validated the entire concept of daylight precision bombing. The Mustang's extraordinary range allowed fighters to escort bombers throughout entire missions to any target in Germany and back to England. German fighters could no longer wait for escorts to reach fuel limits before attacking bombers. Every bomber formation now flew with fighter protection throughout the mission, forcing German interceptors to fight through escort screens before reaching bombers. This operational reality changed the fundamental nature of air combat over Germany, from primarily bomber defensive operations to fighter versus fighter engagements, where American numerical superiority and superior aircraft performance proved decisive. Bomber defensive guns remained important backup protection, but became secondary to the shield provided by escorting fighters who destroyed German interceptors before they reached bombing formations. The impact on German fighter pilot morale proved devastating, as experienced pilots recognized that tactical conditions had shifted decisively against them. Attacking bomber formations protected by superior long-range fighters meant engaging opponents who held every significant advantage in aircraft performance, numerical strength, pilot training quality, and tactical initiative. German pilots found themselves forced into defensive combat, where American fighters dictated engagement terms, while German pilots struggled simply to survive long enough to disengage and return to base. The psychological burden of knowing that every mission likely meant encountering superior opponents in superior aircraft, with minimal chance of achieving meaningful success while facing substantial probability of death or serious injury, created unsustainable stress levels that broke even experienced pilots. Morale collapsed across German fighter units during spring 1944 as pilots watched their comrades die at rates that clearly could not continue indefinitely, while achieving negligible impact on American bombing operations that proceeded with increasing effectiveness despite German defensive efforts. The human cost of the bomber, offensive against Germany, accumulated to staggering totals that illustrated the brutal arithmetic of sustained strategic bombing operations. The 8th Air Force lost more than 26,000 men killed in action during the war, more than 4,000 aircraft destroyed in combat or accidents, and additional thousands of men seriously wounded or captured after being shot down over German-controlled territory. These casualties exceeded the losses sustained by many ground combat divisions and represented sacrifice on a scale that Americans focused primarily on ground combat often failed to fully appreciate. Every mission cost lives. Every target required crews willing to fly into defended airspace, knowing that statistics showed 1 in 3 crews would not complete their 25 mission tours intact. The willingness of men to continue flying under these conditions spoke to courage that deserves remembering and honoring alongside the sacrifices of ground combat infantry who faced different but equally deadly dangers. The gradual shift in air superiority over Europe during 1944 reflected not single decisive battle, but cumulative effects of sustained operations that progressively wore down German defensive capabilities faster than they could be regenerated. German fighter production actually increased during 1944 despite intensive Allied bombing of aircraft factories, reaching levels that exceeded 1,943 output substantially. However, Germany could not produce experienced pilots at rates matching aircraft production. Training programs shortened dangerously, as fuel shortages, limited flight hours, and loss of experienced instructors reduced training quality. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal preparation and survived only a handful of missions on average before being killed or seriously wounded. The Luftwaffe hemorrhaged irreplaceable, experienced pilots, whose loss degraded unit effectiveness far beyond simple numbers. An air force equipped with thousands of modern fighters but crewed by inadequately trained pilots could not defend effectively against opponents who combined superior equipment with thorough training and overwhelming numerical advantage. The impact of strategic bombing on German war production remained subject to debate among historians, who noted that German industrial output continued increasing into 1,944, despite sustained bombing campaigns. However, this production increase came despite massive disruption and resource diversion required to maintain output under constant attack. Germany employed millions of workers in air defense, damage repair, production dispersal, and related activities that contributed nothing to direct war production. Resources diverted to building and manning thousands of heavy flak guns might otherwise have produced tanks or artillery for ground forces. Fighter aircraft and pilots required for homeland defense could not support ground operations in Russia or France. The indirect costs of defending against strategic bombing arguably exceeded the direct destruction of industrial facilities and represented resource expenditure. Germany could not sustain, while simultaneously fighting ground campaigns on multiple fronts, against opponents with superior resources. The moral courage demonstrated by bomber crews extended beyond physical bravery under fire to include ethical choices about participating in operations that inevitably killed civilians, despite targeting military objectives. Crews understood intellectually that bombs dropped from high altitude, using primitive bomb sites, often missed intended targets and destroyed residential areas instead. They saw the firestorms, their incendiary bombs created in German cities, and knew that thousands of non-combatants died in flames and collapsing buildings. Some men struggled with moral implications of participating in bombing operations that seemed to cross ethical boundaries between legitimate military action and terrorizing civilian populations. Others rationalized civilian casualties as unavoidable side effects of operations necessary to defeat regime that had initiated war and committed atrocities across Europe. The moral complexity of strategic bombing resisted simple resolution and created psychological burdens that men carried long after the war ended, sometimes causing lasting distress that manifested in various ways throughout their post-war lives. The technical limitations of high-altitude bombing with available technology meant that even missions targeting legitimate military objectives often produced results far removed from precision doctrine claimed as justification for daylight operations. Bombing from 25,000 feet through cloud cover, flak, and fighter opposition using Norden bomb sites that functioned best under ideal conditions rarely achieved accuracy sufficient to hit specific buildings within large industrial complexes. Many bombs fell hundreds or thousands of feet from aim points, destroying whatever happened to occupy the ground where they impacted. Post-war bomb damage assessment revealed that many raids caused minimal damage to intended targets, while devastating surrounding areas containing residential housing and civilian infrastructure. This gap between precision doctrine and operational reality raised questions about whether daylight bombing achieved sufficient military advantages over area bombing to justify the additional costs in aircraft and crews that daylight operations required compared to night bombing alternatives. The personal stories of individual crew members who flew combat missions illustrate the human dimension of strategic bombing that statistics and tactical analysis cannot fully capture. Men like Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a ball turret gunner who flew 32 missions with the 381st Bomb Group, experienced the war from perhaps the most claustrophobic and vulnerable position on any bomber. Warner described the psychological challenge of hanging suspended beneath the aircraft in a rotating sphere barely large enough to contain his body and his guns, unable to wear a parachute, completely dependent on crew members to hand-crank him back into the fuselage if the turret power failed, or if the order came to bail out. He watched fighters attack from below, fired thousands of rounds at targets that appeared briefly before flashing past, and witnessed bombers fall from formation with turrets identical to his still occupied by gunners who had no chance to escape. Warner survived his tour and returned home, but like many combat veterans, he carried psychological scars that never fully healed, experiencing nightmares and anxiety attacks decades after the war ended, whenever he found himself in confined spaces that triggered memories of the ball turret. The ground crews who maintained bombers and prepared them for each mission contributed essentially to operations' success, despite receiving far less recognition than flight crews who faced enemy fire. Crew chiefs and mechanics worked through nights after bombers returned from missions, repairing battle damage, replacing engines, patching holes in aluminum skin, and servicing systems to ensure aircraft remained flyable for the next mission. They worked in all weather conditions, often outdoors in freezing temperatures, with inadequate lighting and tools that sometimes broke or wore out without available replacements. They took professional pride in their work and personal pride in crews who flew the aircraft they maintained, feeling genuine grief when bombers they had serviced failed to return from missions. The relationship between ground crews and flight crews created bonds based on mutual dependence and shared purpose, with flight crews trusting their lives to ground crews' technical competence, and ground crews invested emotionally in flight crews' survival and success. The innovation and adaptation that characterized American bombing operations reflected organizational culture that encouraged learning from experience and modifying tactics and equipment based on operational results rather than rigid adherence to preconceived doctrine. When frontal attacks proved devastatingly effective against early B-17 models, designers added chin turrets to address the vulnerability. When formation tactics proved inadequate against coordinated German attacks, tacticians developed new formations that improved defensive coverage. When escort fighters initially struggled to coordinate with bombers, procedures evolved to improve cooperation and effectiveness. This willingness to acknowledge problems, analyze failures systematically, and implement solutions quickly represented organizational strength that contributed significantly to eventual success. Organizations that cannot adapt to changing circumstances fail when faced with competent opponents who exploit weaknesses. American bomber forces demonstrated capacity for evolution and improvement that German forces found increasingly difficult to match as war progressed and their resources became progressively more constrained. The strategic debate within American military leadership about bombing priorities and targeting philosophy continued throughout the war, with different factions advocating various approaches based on competing theories about how best to employ limited bomber resources for maximum strategic effect. Some argued for focusing attacks on specific industries, like ball bearings or oil production, whose destruction would cripple German war economy. Others advocated attacking transportation networks to prevent movement of troops and supplies. Still others believed that attacking cities would break civilian morale and force Germany to surrender regardless of military situation. These debates reflected genuine uncertainty about optimal strategies in unprecedented situation where massive industrial resources allowed sustained bombing campaigns, but without clear historical precedents to guide targeting decisions. The eventual solution involved combination of approaches rather than commitment to single theory, with different priorities receiving emphasis at different times based on evolving strategic situations and assessment of what targets offered best return on investment of scarce bomber resources and crew lives. The legacy of World War II strategic bombing extended far beyond immediate military outcomes to influence post-war aviation technology, military doctrine, and international law governing armed conflict. The experience of bomber formations fighting through determined opposition demonstrated both the potential and limitations of strategic bombing as military instrument. Post-war air forces absorbed lessons about importance of air superiority, inadequacy of defensive armament alone against competent opposition, and challenges of achieving precision bombing results under combat conditions. Shaped Cold War strategic thinking about nuclear deterrence, development of jet bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and evolution of air defense systems designed to counter strategic bombing threats. International legal frameworks attempted to codify principles distinguishing legitimate military targets from protected civilian populations, though enforcement mechanisms remained limited, and definitions subject to interpretation that allowed substantial variation in actual practice during subsequent conflicts. The courage and sacrifice of bomber crews who flew repeated missions into defended German airspace contributed decisively to Allied victory through sustained operations that Germany ultimately could not counter effectively. Their willingness to face repeated danger despite horrific casualties demonstrated resolve that exceeded anything training could instill or orders could command. They flew because their country asked them to, because their crew members depended on them, because the mission required completion regardless of cost, and because abandoning the effort meant abandoning principles they believed worth defending. Their service reminds us that freedom often requires sacrifice, that victory demands persistence through adversity, and that ordinary people regularly demonstrate extraordinary courage when circumstances demand they rise above normal human limitations to accomplish things that seem impossible, until someone proves otherwise, through action rather than words. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.